Angus MacNeil, MP, thanks so much for joining us today as part of Food Sovereignty Week. Why are so many shelves in supermarkets and local shops empty right now?
Well, it's quite a simple reason. The Road Haulage Association told me many months ago, in fact, as chair of the International Trade Committee, that something like 85% of the drivers who were hauling stuff into the UK were from places such as Poland, Lithuania, Slovenia, and Spain. And as a result of the noises of Brexit and the hassles they were getting, and the fact they could get other jobs across Europe without the difficulties of queuing for ferries, which is bad enough, but queuing ferries with border hassles, that they wouldn't be coming to the UK if they could possibly avoid it. And of course, we've got within the UK government refusing to make this a sort of a critical area of employment, and the Home Office is not even helpful to taking hauliers from across Europe to work in the UK at present on sort of domestic routes. One thing I found out this morning, just at what for, is Asda alone take 50 lorries a day from Spain. So if you think Asda are doing that, and then what are Morrison's doing, what are Sainsbury's doing, what are Tesco's doing? Some of them will be doing more, and some of them will be the same. So it's quite clear that if you don't have the arteries of commerce functioning, you'll find that the oxygenated blood isn't arriving on the shelves, if you like, and that would be the food and the veg that people have taken for granted for so long.
So we are seeing, as customers, we are seeing shelves being empty. That's what customers are seeing. What are people who are providing foods in Scotland seeing? As a crofter, as yourself, what are people like you and other food producers seeing as the impacts of Brexit?
Many are seeing increased costs at the moment of medicines and food. On the island here, I was recently at an oyster farm, and while their market is domestic, he claims he's being hit by the other side. Most of his inputs and his equipment is coming from Europe, and most of the stuff he has from grading stuff is coming from Europe, and it's difficult to get some stuff. So even to produce things becomes a difficulty because of the inputs they have from Europe. And I think that the one thing I say about Brexit is I know more this month than last month. I know more next month than I do this month. It's a multi-headed, multifaceted cluster mess, if you like, to sort of sanitize the word somewhat. But it's not helping anybody at all, and an awful lot of exporters have just stopped exporting to the European Union. I think, according to the Food and Drink Federation, with the UK as a whole is 50% down on its food exports to the European Union, and it's been huge difficulties for people. I mean, there's a fish factory here in the constituency in the Hebrides here, which used to export to the European Union at a cost of 32 pence a kilo, is now, with the paperwork and the delays and the difficulties and everything else it's got to do, that cost is up around £1 a kilo. So you can see people's profit margins being squeezed and viabilities of businesses probably coming into question.
And those prices are possibly going to be pushed on to the consumer. So the foods that we are seeing in our shops are likely or possibly likely to be more expensive than they are. So that's another clear negative impact of Brexit.
I mean, I think before this, even when you remove the currency changes of fluctuation, Sainsbury's said that the cost would be, I think, 9% extra in the average shopping basket, which is a lot of money in people's household budgets if you're running a tight ship. And it's something that's maybe more difficult for MPs and anybody earning over 20,000-30,000 perhaps, or depending on how many's in your family or whatever. But anybody on a decent salary over 30,000 or so can probably appreciate and grasp really, because if you're having to make ends meet and you're just making ends meet, that additional cost will be significant and serious, and that's why we're wanting the government to keep that extra £20 that's going towards people who really need it, and people who'll spend it, and people who make sure that money's in the economy and circulating.
Is that the top up for universal credit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that's Brexit from consumers' perspective, and also from some of the farming and fishing producers. this really, when we're covering food sovereignty, we're talking about the resilience of Scotland's food supply. And I just wonder what your view on that was, because I saw a wonderful picture, this picture, which I'll show now, that you tweeted recently. What's your view on the food resilience and food security in Scotland when we're looking at a picture like this?
Well, I mean, I think one of the first things, there's almost two separate things there, but one of the first things you see on the ferry routes is that we're very much have got ourselves in a situation where we're dependent on overland routes, which Ireland was too. The good bit of news that you see from Ireland is that they can quickly change, and they have quickly changed from being dependent on the overland routes, and they saw the overland route as being the most convenient, which is probably what we do in Scotland as well. But you know, when push came to shove, having new ferries going to the sort of the northwest of France and the north of France from the south and southeast of Ireland has become actually more sensible and more cost effective than bothering with crossing England and all the paperwork that is required. Staying within the single market was an awful lot easier than leaving the single market to go back into the single market. So, you know, what we've actually seen happening is the UK has diminished its trading situation, particularly with the Republic of Ireland, who's now for the first time ever got a trading surplus. One of the great effects of Brexit, when the trade has crashed 47.6%, I think it is, over the period with Ireland. Ireland's trade hasn't fallen as much because the UK hasn't got itself into a situation to check its borders so much. And the other thing that's happening is north-south trade north-south trade in Ireland is increasing dramatically as well. I mean, I think there are greater issues on food security over and above the supply lines we've made difficult for ourselves, and maybe I'll talk about that when we come to talking about trade agreements.
Speaking of trade agreements then, as you know, Westminster civil servants are negotiating further trade deals on top of the free trade agreement with Australia, and that's happening at the moment. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest concern, where do you think food security is on the list of the civil servants who are negotiating trade deals at the moment? So 10 being the most and 1 being the least.
Well, I asked that very question to the lead civil servant on the Australian trade negotiations. And I asked it because during the pandemic here, I've been conducting and chairing many of my, or most, if not all, of my International Trade Committee meetings from here in the Hebrides. And, you know, just out in front of my home here is a small cove where a lifeboat landed in 1940-41 December, when it was torpedoed by a U-boat, when the ship was torpedoed by a U-boat. And the issue was they were taking food across the Atlantic because in the 20s and 30s, the UK had sort of abdicated an awful lot of its own food production for the ease of getting it from Canada. And that was fine. They could do that. But when some event happened, the UK found itself woefully short and found itself in great difficulty. And of course, the famous rationing had to come in. So food security, to answer the question, was just a complete blank stare. It's not something on the remit of UK trade negotiators at all when they're going near trade deals. Now, the upshot of this could be, at the moment, probably unlikely to have much effect from Australia in practical terms, but it means that there's the sort of Damocles, however, hanging over much production in the UK. Because if something were to happen in Asia or some sort of black swan event that we can't sort of contemplate at the moment, you could see Australia sending its produce at a cheaper rate into this market, destroying farming here, and then maybe later withdrawing that. Now, once you've destroyed farming and crofting, you won't recreate it very quickly, because if the sheep and the cattle aren't there, for instance, or the crops haven't been planted, you can't just magic them out of the air at the click of a finger. Some of that will take years to re-establish again. So that's a clear difficulty. And it's just, is it really worthwhile? We know that from and Brexit is costing in terms of GDP. The typical term is 4.9% it's going to cost over the next number of years. So I often say that for every £490, therefore, that we forfeit in GDP from Brexit, the trade deals are bringing back a pittance. The Australian trade deal is worth £2, an American trade deal is worth about £20, and a New Zealand trade deal is worth about £1. And Canada is probably much the same, because we had an agreement with Canada anyway. And if we get into this famous CPTPP, the Great Pacific Club, that's probably only worth about a fiver. So all in all, for the 490 we've lost, if I aggregate all that up, you're only getting back about £28, which leaves you in a £462 deficit, and you're putting your own farming at risk by doing all this. I mean, the one enemy of Brexit and the argument of Brexiteers are numbers, really. Examples are what underpins those numbers. But the numbers just demolish the folly of what the UK government is doing at the moment, as do the sort of empty shelves that many people are witnessing.
You're right. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the importance of trade deals, and trade is very much open and free at the moment. So any of these trade deals are only kind of shaving off elements, small percentages, as you said. And also you mentioned about Australia and possibly Canadian food coming in. It is cheaper because of the production process in those countries. And when it's arriving in the supermarkets, it is a cheaper option. And if we are experiencing as a lot of people are, issues with income, then it's likely that those choices will be the ones that will be made in shops, which again directly impacts the suppliers of local foods and produce in Scotland. So what can the Scottish Government do? What are the Scottish Government doing to kind of increase the resilience in Scotland's food supply and food security? Because we can't just say Westminster's not doing enough. What can we do?
Well, I think ultimately what we can do and what we have to do is get moving in independence. We can't moan forever about what the UK government is doing to us or the path the UK government is taking us down if we aren't trying to shift ourselves and extricate ourselves from that situation. It's quite obvious the direction of travel of the UK government, and it's not been great direction of travel for most of my lifetime. If we think of Thatcher, if we think of Major or Blair or even Brown himself or David Cameron or Theresa May, or now it's hard to say, weighing up Boris and Thatcher, which was the worst. But or even Blair starting wars illegally, which has been the worst of all these choices. But surely the choice we have to make is the choice that we decide ourselves, and we don't have these guys deciding things for us. And we've got complaints over food or whatever. We stop moaning about it, and we start taking action to make the decisions in our own hands, and not things that are constantly foisted on us that we then moan about and do nothing about. I mean. And this isn't just in the food area, this is but on all areas at the moment. And I think the time is now for the Scottish Government to be go through the process. I mean, we know that take 20 minutes, write the letter asking for the Section 30. You'll get a knockback in 3 weeks' time. That'll be dealt with. Go and legislate in the Parliament. You might find that you can or cannot have a referendum. If you can't have a referendum, then prepare to use the 2026 general election. Hopefully you can have a referendum. We move things on sooner. But all these things and all the problems we've got are just down to one thing: we don't have our own independence, and we're having to take what they're giving us.
So my follow-up question to that is that can Scotland have any kind of food sovereignty as part of the United Kingdom?
No, the decisions are going to be made by them. So no.
So what can we do as individuals to help improve the resilience in the Scottish food and drink sector? Because, we spoke about Westminster and what the Scottish Government can do to push independence, but what can we start doing as consumers and individuals to really secure the food supply in Scotland?
I mean, I suppose it's to buy widely and buy locally and make sure you're buying Scottish produce. But I mean, that's very difficult to sort of bring on, so you've got to bring the whole orchestra with you. What I'm talking about there is at best a couple of musicians might choose to do that, but we need the government to be able to conduct that as a policy that the entire orchestra of the nation, if you like, can play along with, because that's really what it is, meaningful impact. And unless we have that, we don't really have the impact we could have. And I'm not in any way decrying people who are trying individually to do that. Big political action, and the big political action is where we control and make sure that we're in a situation to do that. Meantime, of course, acts that individuals are doing is, of course, welcome and helpful. It's better than doing nothing. It's far better than doing nothing. The worst of all choices is, in fact, doing nothing. So, I think it's very self-explanatory to people. They know what they have to do. You pointed out yourself, of course, William, that the difficulty is for many and squeezed budgets that it's not always easy to do that sort of stuff. So we have to make sure that we're creating a society that's a bit more like the Nordics, and we have less inequality, and we don't have things like food banks being required in our society too. That's where some of our real problems lie. is the choices people are forced to take, not choices they want to take, but for choices they're forced to take because of the economic situation we've set up for ourselves by being part of the UK, and they've foisted upon us. So let's get that changed.
You mentioned their individual acts and what we can do as an individual. I'm going to lead into the Internal Markets Act, and I wonder what your view is of that. What impact is that having in Scotland and likely to have over the next couple of years?
Well, I think, as we know, it's a power grab, and where we've got certain food standards in Scotland, these might be trumped by what they might want to foist upon us, and it's deeply concerning that this can happen and has happened. And, we make all sorts of noises that this will be terrible for Scotland and this mustn't happen in Scotland. A bit like we said, we wouldn't be taken out of the EU against their will. Well, we have been, and these things are happening to us. And again, it comes back to my earlier points in several answers here. Is your response to all of this is independence. Ireland doesn't have the Internal Markets Act plaguing or bothering it. There's nobody doing interviews in Ireland at the moment asking about the problems of the Internal Markets Act, because it simply doesn't apply. They don't have a government in a foreign nation or a neighbouring nation foisting things on them that they don't want, that their elected representatives don't want, that their electors and people don't want. And this is happening just to us in Scotland on the Internal Markets Act and on everything else. We almost accept that we're going to get stuff we don't like done to us, and it's sort of now part of the psyche. I mean, we're almost worried about waking up in a world where things aren't foisted on us, and every political decision that happens is the choice of the majority of Scotland. I mean, this is normal in normal countries. It's just not normal here, and we accept it. We accept it too readily, probably.
I would agree completely. And I hope by focusing on areas like food and on climate, that we can start to say to people that if these are things that they're really interested and concerned about, they need to look to see if independence is the answer. And maybe they get to independence that way rather than the pure constitutional need that a lot of people feel, but these areas are important. With my Scotonomics head on, because as we spoke earlier, I host the Scotonomics show with Kieran Van Sweden. I would love to get your opinion on the economy in Scotland, because we've mentioned as an kind of undercurrent to a lot of your answers this need to create a better society. How do we do that? As briefly as you can, weighing up this kind of neoliberal model of continuing what the British state does, as suggested by the Sustainable Growth Commission, the SNP's report in 2019, or this alternative way of looking at an economy, which is kind of classed as MMT, modern monetary theory?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend, the brief answers, I recommend everybody to read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, because that is just an absolute cracker of a book. And it shows what Scotland can do. But, there's so much in and amongst what you've said there. And one of the things that I think that a myth that people have been fed very often is that sort of the economy is some sort of abstract thinking machine of its own. And really what is happening in every country, and particularly in the UK, is a whole pile of rules, laws and regulations that go on to feed economic activity and economic action. And we are living in that system. Now, they try and paint it in the UK as if it's not a sort of a design system, but it's a very designed system. And you mentioned the environment there earlier. We, where I am here, fortunately and unfortunately, fortunately if you want to have renewable energy, unfortunately if you want to travel by ferry, sometimes is we've got some of the best wind resources in all of Europe. That wind is not really being tapped at all because of the rules and the regulations set up by Ofgem and the UK government about the transmission of this energy. You can transmit energy from Norway onto the Scottish mainland far cheaper, and Denmark and France and the Netherlands and Belgium and Ireland, in fact, far cheaper than you can from the Scottish Islands onto the Scottish mainland, all because of the rules that are set up in the UK. There's probably no other government in Europe, if it was sitting on, as Alex Salmond once memorably called, the Saudi Arabia of renewables, that would squander that resource, that daily resource, in the way the UK government has squandered it. So, unless we have the full control, and that control, as Stephanie Kelton and others would argue, Richard Murphy would argue, over your own currency, we see how powerful that has been for governments across the world at the moment. We know now that governments are just about, they're not really borrowing off anybody in particular, they're borrowing off their left hand, so their right hand can distribute it around and then they take it back in tax. We know this is happening. I think The Economist J.K. Galbraith said, if people understood, if the mind understood, if minds understood how easily money is created, they would be repulsed. We've been led to believe that so and so are money creators, that crofters or farmers or fishermen are money creators. Well, the crofters, farmers, and fishermen that I see around me, ask them to take their money out of their pocket and it says Bank of Scotland or Royal Bank of Scotland. They've created none of it themselves. This money has been created and distributed. It's an oil that goes around the economy, and I think MMT provides huge answers for our societies in the future. And it's a theory of money that's being listened to. The government doesn't tax and spend; it spends and taxes. And what is a deficit is sort of untaxed expenditure. But the government's deficit then becomes the public surplus. So the preoccupation that we've had from the Tories of austerity and balancing the government books looks extremely wrong-headed. And in the light of that, it looks even worse when you take a further step back and think of the health implications that the policies of George Osborne have probably rained down on families across the UK over the last number of years. Probably the malnourishment that some children have had, the lack of concentration they've been able to do in school, the educational losses as a result of that, all because they worship money and misunderstand money. So, I think there are a number of reasons to be independent, but there are a number of reasons to understand as well some of the wider things that are going on in the world and some of the wider theories. And rather than find ourselves in systems such as the UK or enslaved to some sort of philosophies such as monetarism, which have created an awful lot of difficulty for people, let's reevaluate that and let's change that. And let's make sure what we do in the future is with the best information, the best knowledge, and the best outcomes for people, young and old, but particularly the young.
Well, we started discussing food sovereignty, and that's really us ending on monetary sovereignty, which is the need for a country to have its own currency and to decide how to spend it and how to inject it into the economy. And you're saying, that's one way to look at these huge problems that we've got in our society, is to look at how we manage money, how we view money, and how we run our economy. And hopefully we can have much more sovereignty across everything that we do. Angus, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been great hearing your views, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thanks. All the best now. See you.